Hello and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larsson.
Simon, thanks very
Tom.
much for joining me today on the Grow Places podcast. Thanks for having me over at your lovely office. We're surrounded by models and maquettes and in Perseverance Works, which is one of my favourite places in East London. I was just saying to your colleague before we came on that it would be amazing if we could just continue to build stuff that had this feel and felt amazing like this, like it did in that period. But maybe we can unpack some of that today together. But first of all, why don't we just do a little intro to yourself?
Okay. Well, thanks, Tom. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm an avid listener. So I have run a practice called Henley Halebrown for 30 years. And I studied in the University of Liverpool and a bit in the States. And I think I probably do owe quite a lot of my kind of concerns and interests actually to things like travelling to India early on as a student, studying in America, and not just to the architecture, but to the societies and particularly probably to the landscapes and the climate and how all those things relate to one another. And as a practice, we kind of started out actually just making interiors. And what was really important about that, in a way, was the architect was fairly humble, but the kind of question of working with people, working with businesses, because we were basically doing offices, so we were almost like management consultants to these businesses, changing the way they worked. So the architecture was light, but the kind of the theories and the processes were interesting and kind of getting under people's skins. And I think, that's kind of followed through our work. And another thing is that we kind of developed through, we moved through sectors because we started then doing adaptive reuse, what now people call retrofit. Started doing that 29 years ago. And that was huge. Nobody said to us, have you done a housing scheme or a school or whatever? They would say, have you ever adapted an old building? And if we said yes, then they say, oh, by the way, we've then got a project which was such and such. And you go, great.
Yeah, amazing. And that journey is sort of, as you say, fluid and meandering. It'd be great to kind of understand a little bit more about that today from you. Just something you said there. I would say naturally you're probably the furthest away from a management consultant I've seen. I can't imagine you sort of suddenly working for KPMG or something like that. But it's interesting the notion that you described there, like of the role of the architect and how that's evolved for you over time, and you now yourself and you as a practice of the highest kind of standing. You have roles within the RBA and other things around that. So maybe that journey for you through practice, academia, management consultancy, how do you see all those strands for you personally fitting together, and why have you pursued personally being in academia, being in practice in equal figure, really?
Yeah. Well, I think an architect is a polymath. At least you've got to be pretty good at lots of things. Also, you've got to know your limitations. And of course, one of the things is you've got to collaborate with people. You've got to collaborate with people inside your office, and you've got to collaborate with people outside your office. All these dimensions of practice and writing and teaching, they all fuel each other. And we've just published a book called Building for Society, and I think that's a very fair way of describing the way we think. That even though every project has a client, every project is for society. But writing gives you time literally to put your thoughts in order, and teaching gives you an opportunity to voice them, and in a way it's quite an indulgence to expect people to listen to you for hours at a time. I don't mean giving lectures, but just kind of voicing ideas and voicing theories. So in a way it's a real privilege to teach. It's also it's a privilege to write when people, the nicest thing I think is when somebody 5, 10, 15 years, whatever it is, after you've written a book, turns out they've read the book and they want to tell you they've read the book, or a lecturer has been recommending the book to students, or students have said, out of the blue just emailed me and said, I really loved your book or something. But yeah, it's a culture. I mean, it is a business, being part of the world of property and construction, but it's also a culture, and that culture extends. I mean, we organise something called dialogues, which are a slightly grandiose term for talks, but we've been doing them now for about a decade. But of course, the word dialogue is important, because really the point of the talk is to bring a group of people together. Because there's dialogue just in bringing people together. Beforehand, everybody turns up and has a drink and chat, and it's social, but it's also thoughtful. And then, of course, the talk is thoughtful, and then it always ends up leading to questions and conversation and a dialogue, and then might end up in the pub afterwards. So, we are now one of almost, I have European architects wanting to come and talk here, European academics wanting to launch books here through the programme. So it's a kind of really broad church, and we've got artists and all sorts of people wanting to use the platform, so to speak, of dialogues to reach a community of architects and artists and academics. But also, we've had developers speak, we've had all sorts of people speak. So it's a very kind of open forum for conversations about the world we all work in.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's super interesting. And so if you're in a seminar with one of your students, it seems like where you've described your journey through practice and also the wider sort of sphere of architecture, it is sort of following your passions or following what you're interested in, and then that developing into other things, as opposed to an overly controlled or overly kind of planned route through life or route through profession. Is that fair? And is that something you say when you're talking to students about sort of following their intuitions?
To a certain extent, your life is going to be a bit accidental. I mean, I came out of college in '92, and it was a recession, and it was hard to get a job, and so I started teaching straight away. In fact, I did get a job with an architect called Trevor Dannett, who was a very well-known architect involved in the Royal Festival Hall with Leslie Martin. But we were just too far apart age-wise. So when I said I got the invitation to go and teach, he said, I don't think we can combine, you working for me and teaching at the same time. So that in a way, what you realise, of course, also is these threads of your life, take directions that are unforeseen. Anyway, about a year later, I got a job, and but I wasn't really working for somebody I really want to work for. All the people you wanted to work for, it was hugely competitive, those opportunities. And so actually it was that accident of not working for somebody you really wanted to work for that then meant there was an opportunity to set up on our own. And then who you set up with and all these things are kind of to a certain extent accidental. But of course, Gavin Halebrown and I were studying together at Liverpool. And in fact, when we very first all set up, he was in Japan, very quickly joined, and then now here we are 30 years later. But that kind of accidental nature, to a certain extent, has taken us from where we started, I was saying interiors, into kind of adaptive reuse. And then you do competitions, maybe you don't win. In our case, there was a competition which we didn't win, but that led to somebody who's saying, you're really interesting, and what we really want is for you to do. So we then did a piece of research on prison design, which was not to do with the negative aspects of prison, but the really beneficial things about reducing recidivism and improving the prospects of resettlement, i.e. reducing the risks of reoffending or likelihood of reoffending, and how do you sort of prepare people for life outside of prison. And that then led to a series of health centres, which not only took us absolutely into making civic buildings, public buildings, because people at that point didn't really feel like they were making civic health buildings. They were making hospitals and very small sort of GP practices. And the hospitals weren't civic, they were big machines and they still are. Hospitals generally sit sort of slightly remote from the city. They've got too much going on inside them. And then and then you kind of progress into education and housing, and then we felt very comfortable, and we did turn our back on interiors because we wanted to build and we wanted to move into a field where, in a way, every building's about people, and that's of course a truism, and it sort of almost doesn't sound substantive enough when you say it, but actually most architects are preoccupied with what they look like and how they're made. And maybe how they function, but function's not a great word when you're really dealing with people. So we were really interested in people. We were really interested in how they sort of communality, intentional communities, unintentional communities. A working environment is a community. Every business has a kind of culture and heritage, but then you could transpose that to a school. You can transpose that to all sorts of things. So those sort of human dynamics play out, and then how do you plan a building to reflect that human dynamic? So although on one level I was saying, it's an accidental career, and the way I think almost everyone is, what you take with you is your passion and your concerns, your interests, and our interests have always been about these kind of ideas of society, community, communality, people, perception, these kind of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And then do you have a sense for you personally where those interests come from?
Well, I think you can trace it back to our education. Gavin and I were both educated at Liverpool University, and although he went off to Japan and I went off to the States, I think we got a grounding in what we thought was, it was a good education, but I think it was an education that introduced us to good things, if you see what I mean. It made us think about. I hope we have a certain humility well, for example, sustainability is an interesting point. We were being taught about sustainability in the mid-80s. And of course, there was at that point, the oil crisis and the Yom Kippur War of, I think it's 1973, seemed like a lifetime ago because we were about 5 or whatever at the time. But meanwhile in New Mexico and parts of sort of remote parts of the Midwest America, people were building these extraordinary houses out of petrol drums and all sorts of things, making tron walls and thermal mass and dealing with all sorts of ideas about how you essentially zero carbon buildings. And we were talking about that kind of stuff. We were drawing them, studying them, and I guess the thing that we carry with us is this sense of that if you're going to do it, the architecture should really convey it. We talk about a palpable sustainability. We talk about participative sustainability. My real fear is that the solution to sustainability, one that is driven by engineering, is benign. It's a bit like an electric car. You look on the bonnet, there's nothing left other than a box, and I'm not going to say it's wrong, but the unintended consequences of a benign solution to the environment is that, in a sense, you cast the people who are going to use the building into a role of the consumer. And as a result, they think they have rights. Consumers have rights. Whereas if you think of everybody as citizens, then they have responsibilities. And I think that, at the moment, I have no idea where the whole kind of question of how we respond to the environment is going to go. But there is a risk that people become less and less knowledgeable of the problem, and simply the solution is delivered, like so many aspects of life, by these professionals. And we are collectively, you, me, and others, we are part of that professional team. We have a responsibility to do some things, but I also think that if we invite people to understand the way things work, then they can participate, and then they can actually do things to make, it's like they sail the ship rather than, just floor the motorboat.
Yeah. And would you say, paraphrasing that, would you say that sort of, that element of something being greater than the sum of the parts is where, that architectural sensibility comes in and makes something a piece of architecture over, say, a collection of components? Like, I'm trying to, so something that have always struck me in your work and the relationship that we've had going back 15, 16 years now, is that you have a very particular skill of being very good at the practicalities of building, the economics of building, the way things go together, understanding the contractor's needs and desires and the clients, but then sort of elevating it still into something that is a award-winning, exceptional piece of architecture that I think few practices are able to do in such a skilled way. So would you say that is kind of part of embodying that mindset?
I think a good building is dealing with a multitude of things at once. It's dealing with kind of questions of efficiency, microclimate, perception and sensation for the individual, what they're experiencing. So there's sort of, in a broad sense, there's sensation, there's the social thing, there's the construction, there's the viability. There's so many things. But you and I have had these kind of conversations about aspects of a building, and it's great that conversation can slide between a kind of cultural ambition and a commercial reality, not to the one to the expense of the other, but how do these things converge? And I think they can. I mean, we have been for 25 years now or something been exploring kind of the idea of external circulation in schools and housing and the workplace. And it's equally relevant in all, because we're talking about humans and we're talking about buildings and but what we're talking about is things like efficiency. If you take circulation out of a building, your gross area and net area get closer together. If you think of a school where the classroom, there's not that corridor and classrooms facing outwards, but away from each other. The corridor in a school is a real problem. It's kind of classic where sort of the antisocial behaviour and management of kids is at its most awkward, and you see lots of schools with a line down the middle of the corridor and people being treated like vehicles driving in opposite directions, which is demonstrates that there's a problem. The alternative, of course, is that you, as we did with our Hackney Primary School, and I think the courtyard is a recurring theme in our work. It's not the only solution, because when we worked on Trimbury, again, we brought quite eclectic uses together around a courtyard, and they were purposefully different, not homogenous. But going back to the school, the class, the child, everybody has they just go out the door and they're in the outside, so they have a better understanding of the weather and time of day and time of year, which are all aspects of the environment. So, not to dwell on this issue of sort of sustainability, but that's a really good way of teaching kids, as we've had the head of the primary school specifically said, that's great. I can literally explain lots of things to these kids about the environment and therefore sustainability. And that school stayed open when most schools didn't, when the temperature hit 40 degrees C 2-3 summers ago. So it works, as well as all these other things. And I think that, for me, that's a really good. There are obviously other typologies, and there are other solutions or whatever, other kinds of ways of planning buildings. But that kind of overlap of a multitude of things is really crucial, I think, to the success of a building.
So what you've been describing there, Simon, is, for me at least, is that you take these practical constraints or these aspirations around a brief or the economics of building, and you kind of elevate them through the use of external walkways or other things like you just referred to with the school, that are both a practical solution but also a very humane solution. And I think that something that I'm quite passionate about is the fact that we can have these, what on the surface could maybe seem like competing agendas, the sort of humanity of a place and the kind of hard economics. But if you do something where everyone is in the room at the outset and everyone's kind of objectives are clear, actually, like the strength of the project and the uniqueness of the project can kind of come out of that. And I think that's where we see value in what we do. And maybe that the school, you might say, was quite a good example of that.
Yeah. But so were other things. I mean, I'm thinking of, well, first of all, the work we did at Edith, and then we did with the Poppy Factory, and then more recently done Truman Brewery. Each time, you and Ron and your team brought a kind of a wisdom and a set of let's say responsibilities. But then similarly we did. But it's not so much about who said what or did what, but it's actually the idea that when we work together, you kind of don't quite know what's going to happen. And I think I mentioned it earlier, there's this kind of capacity to move between these kind of great ranges of things, which I can remember when I first started working with you and Ron, which is going back, as you say, like 16 years or something. I sort of thought, dare I say what I'm thinking? dare I reference a 17th century church or something? Right, I'm going to do it, And both of you didn't look kind of completely like, oh, what is he talking about? This is really not relevant. So, you temper perhaps the extreme interests in things or whatever it might be, but it was great that we could have those conversations because, it's 300 years since Vanbrugh died, and you see that Vanbrugh had most of the same challenges, that we have. And I don't just mean architects, but he was an architect, and here we are. And we sort of often think that life's just getting more and more difficult, but actually it was ever thus, these things. But I think that, I was thinking of the Truman Brewery and what, it's funny, we had most of our meetings in the project meetings we had in our office, in our meeting room. And it's not a very big room, and but it was a reasonably big team, and some people are online. And maybe there's something about the intimacy of the room, but there was also a lot about the way you conducted the meetings, and people were able to. I suppose people didn't necessarily just turn up with their preconceived ideas. I think, things have changed, and if you do wind back 20 or 30 years, you could have had a team of kind of architect, quantity surveyor, structural engineer, service engineer, and pretty much they might have had quite big teams behind them. But there may have been and the client, but small design team working with the client, dealing with working with the planners. They were also a small team, so half a dozen people, and in fact those half a dozen people will probably never be in a room together. 4 or 5 of them will be in the room together. It's like a kind of supper, around a table. Mm-hmm. The kind of conversations and the kind of freedom to be wrong and all those kind of things. I think it was easier in the past, and also there was less information and less regulation, and there were less, sort of less channels of expertise. So now we are dealing with a world with multiple channels of expertise. And I think most people, their solution to that is, in a way, I offer this information and I just keep saying the same thing in every meeting, whoever it is. Whereas I think on the Truman Brewery and other things we've done, that doesn't happen. There is a confidence in that group of people to pose questions and promote scenarios that in other more formal and processes that there isn't that opportunity. And it's not, it is a consequence of the time that we find ourselves in that situation, but actually seeing a way through and creating a culture that works better in the current context of many people being involved is a great asset for you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I agree. I think it is quite core to the culture that we talk about. You've talked about dialogue and that being very important to how we make better places, make better buildings. Would you say that, like, with that, you obviously, like, I take the example, whether it's removing balconies from a scheme because you don't really need a balcony on a 30-story building. It might be better to have internal space. Where you're pushing against regulation or you're pushing against the status quo, but you're doing it from a place that maybe does have groundings in multiple things. Maybe it is a better economic way to build, but maybe it is actually just a better home for someone.
Yeah.
That takes a level of kind of gravitas, a level of confidence, however you want to talk about that, from the project team, but also from you individually. And so back to this sort of, I think is particularly interesting about you, is you're now practice, scholar, education. I know it's not unique to you, but that kind of series of things, do you think that actually makes you a better practicing architect? Because you have more conviction, you can bring up the sort of obscure 17th century reference, or you can, do something that elevates the conversation from the kind of the now into something contextual?
I think, well, probably at this point I should firmly say it's not me, is it? It's there's 30 of us, mm-hmm. and Gavin and our associates and our whole kind of leadership team, but then everybody else, down to people who've only just come out of college in the last couple of years. Everybody's got perspective and skills and strengths, and especially of course when you've been working with somebody for 30 plus years, and when you've got other people who've been working with us for 29, 17, whatever it is, 20 years. There's people who've been working with us for 20 to 30 years. So we really do know each other, and we really do know our strengths. And so I think, but I think what I might and others will bring is curiosity. Maybe it's as simple as that, just to keep exploring, questioning things, But we also have a certain amount of, as you say, it's that conviction and curiosity, because on one level, you remain open-minded to the solution until you think you've got the right solution, and then you might actually sort of be quite determined and say, no, I really think this is the right answer. And maybe that scenario with the tower, where we managed to design out the balconies. I mean, that was it was a regulatory requirement, but it was by us and Ron working with the housing people, the regen people, all the planners, all these people within Hammersmith and Fulham, and they were all able to engage. They could see the kind of conflicts within the assumed solution, and so whether it was to do with people not understanding whether a winter garden, which bits of the winter garden were going to affect their heating bill, or whether the child on the balcony was vulnerable. Anyway, so all these scenarios one plays through, and in the end you arrive at something which is kind of unexpected, and you say ultimately was going to be, will be a better home. Mm.
Yeah. And where do you see that, we talked about client-architect relationship there a little bit. Are there other examples from your work, not directly with ourselves, but other people, where you go, okay, actually, I don't know, Copper Lane maybe comes to mind, like the co-housing that you've done there, or maybe you've got other examples?
There's probably lots of examples.
Yeah.
There's ones that sort of, the Copper Lane was interesting because it was a first co-housing scheme, and in London, and one of very few in the UK. There are more. Reason we won that competition was because we said there's more to co-housing than just calling it co-housing. That you needed to develop a plan which reflected that communality, that intentional communality. And I mean, it was really. I feel like there are various instances over the last, whatever it is now, 3 decades, where you feel kind of it's hugely humbling when you see people themselves taking huge risks, or and in that case, people were taking huge risk. The risk to arrive at something where within that little community, people were pulling in quite different directions. They were under kind of quite a lot of economic stress. There were all sorts of things which made it. It was to say it wasn't that it wasn't a professional process. But if you've ever designed a house for a family, that's very stressful for the family to commit to having a house designed and built, not for the architect. We put 6 households together. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of stuff going on. But another example was a project which we did best part 20 years ago for a school, and we had three groups of clients, I guess. We had the trustees, and we had the senior leadership team, and we had the it was a Catholic school, so that they had monks still, and we were sort of talking to each of them, and the whole process happened very, very quickly. And I would go to various meetings, and there was a autumn where we were working towards planning application, and every time I went back to see the monks, one of the monks had died. Literally 2 or 3 monks died over a 3-month period, and you just realised how there was just something about that sort of mortality and the permanence of the building and the commitment they were making at the tail end of their lives to the process, to the building, which was, for kids, children. This kind of investment in these things survive beyond us, and that was particularly kind of poignant. But it doesn't matter whether health centres or office buildings or the work we did with Talkback to make that office was extraordinary. It was extraordinary, but the process, the freedom we were given again through this kind of conversation about what might a place where people work be like. Could it be like a kind of cloister? Could it be almost like a planned around a garden? This Talkback in those days was making comedy, but what they were doing was they were kind of like a research lab. So that idea of a kind of monastery for funny people is kind of what it was. Yeah. And it was, in a way, it was very direct because they could all see each other, because they could all come out. We replaced all the windows with doors, created decks and balconies on every floor. And then it made the organisation, these sort of 300 people who came together to make programmes. They had a lot of people who would come and go to production teams get built, as it were, for maybe 6-month process, and then people dissipate. But what actually happened was they were sort of regrouping around the building in all the different production offices, and then there'd be a kind of core group of people who were sort of permanent. But then you could sort of see how it was a bit like a university with the staff and the undergrads, and this kind of fluidity and this energy, but also this wisdom, and how a piece of architecture could reflect that culture and that process. And so I think what I like is when I can look at a project and describe how the building reflects the organisation, and it may be a place of work, it may be a health centre, it may be a school, it may be housing. All these fields are kind of equally fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think that's really really beautiful way of describing it, actually. And I'm sure whether it's that kind of monastic principles or lifestyle, or as you say, people who are really kind of passionate and purposeful about what they do, that must, over the years, back to sort of culture and community within your organisation, that must have shaped how you think about the world. Like, so I don't know, are there any other specific examples where you would go, we really learned, from spending time with the monks and learning about their approach to life, that really kind of became a bedrock of maybe the next 5 years of projects? Or I don't know if it's easy enough to think about it in that way.
I think there are certain things that we perhaps revisit. So I've talked about courtyards quite a lot, but also the idea of a building being civic. So a courtyard suggests that something's inward looking, not introspective, but the fascinating thing about a courtyard is it actually gives if everybody faces the courtyard notionally, then they can all see each other. So they have a really strong visual image of themselves as a group of people, which works in many, many fields. Equally, a building has a civic responsibility. It's part of the city. It shapes space. I mean, so when we're making a building, we're shaping the spaces that people use who are using the building. We also shape the spaces that people use as they're kind of passing the building. And I think you can see how one project leads to another to a certain extent, and certain patterns repeat. It's less, especially just sort of broader questions. For example, there's a chap called Robin Dunbar, something called Dunbar's Number, which is a piece of research done by an anthropologist, sociologist, who's looking at things like trust. how many people can you know and trust? How many people would you, I don't know, share a pot and pan? How many people would you share a pot and pan with? How many people you go around to their house? How many people would you stop on the corner of the street? And without sounding very dogmatic, there are scalar patterns of sort of social structure that work. Some people are really gregarious and somehow have the capacity to hold a multitude of friendships and relationships, but most of us will fall into a certain pattern, which means that buildings or places, settlements, communities, they do sort of they follow that pattern, and I think that I find that fascinating. It doesn't tell us what to do, but it sort of guides you in how to. And we learnt a lot of this stuff right back at the beginning when I was saying about working in a workspace, in offices and stuff. Because what you realised was that they were continuously managing large groups of people, and for example, if you were so to speak an important person in the office, the thing you needed to do was be able to hide. If you were a young new person in the office, what you needed to do was sort of be visible. So actually, rather than just sitting everybody at desks, we developed it was that point in time where mobile phones, laptops, Wi-Fi, not so much Wi-Fi, but internet. So in other words, the work environment was working life was radically changing. Therefore, the working environment started to change radically, and people started talking about hot desking. But actually, what that was just shrinking the available space in which people worked. Whereas, what was much more interesting was that you could make a working environment which in a way was like a kind of microcosm of the world outside. It wasn't necessarily functionally doing it, but there were times when some people needed big surfaces or quiet spaces or whatever. But also it has that kind of complexity that people could see themselves in, and they could find places. And it's not like they would only use one part of the office, depending on what they were doing and whether they needed to concentrate, or whether they needed to see people. They would kind of inhabit this ecosystem, this habitat, in a way that suited them, depending on who they were, time of day, whatever it was, whatever they were doing. But so there's sort of these real underpinnings of social logic.
Yeah,
I think are really important. But also we're interested in the fabric. A really well-made building is also really dignifying. And so that kind of it groups of people, especially when you're making affordable housing and public buildings, which may be fairly humble, like a health centre or a school. Office is slightly different, but but these buildings they need to project a confidence in the people who are using them, and give people respect.
Yeah.
And that the durability of the building as well as the organisation of the building, they work in concert, and they're part and parcel of that same ambition, I think.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear your process there. And then maybe just like practical example, if we stay on kind of how you work for a second, like, I don't know, the phone rings tomorrow for a new site, new client, almost the land use doesn't matter for the second.
Yeah.
You've got that window of time between the phone ringing and your first meeting with the client. Like, how do you sort of find your way into a project that means that first client meeting has that image of a chapel next to an office building, or wherever it might be? Like, what is that kernel of process for you guys that sort of summarises everything that you've talked about and brings it practically into how you work?
I'm not sure a lot happens that first 24 hours.
Yeah.
That sounds terrifying. It's all done.
Yeah.
I think you do want to get an insight into who it's for. You need to be. It's interesting to be interested in the people you're working with and for, and it's interesting to look at the place that this thing might happen in. And in a way, I think you'd expect me to say this, but to really mean it, to really be curious about those things. And that's probably as much as you can do in the first, to want to ask the questions you need to be able to ask.
Yeah. Well, if you extend it out to, I don't know,
Yeah.
stage 0, stage
Yeah,
1,
yeah,
then are you reaching for a book? Are you
Oh, I
sort
see,
of going
yeah.
for, like, how do you kind of navigate that phone call to concept stage, if you want to call it that?
Well, I do think that you start with kind of quantums of people and activities. And I suppose it's interesting to take something like the new office building we've just completed, Barge Crescent on the South Bank, and it replaced a series of office buildings which were sort of unimpressive, let's say, built in the late 80s, early 90s. They were deeply illogical in terms of inefficiency. They weren't big buildings, nor is the new building that big. But in a way, they were faced this fairly nondescript street. It's a bit of upper ground, behind the Oxford Tower, so very close to the the kind of significant buildings on the South Bank, or at least some of the significant buildings on the South Bank. But it was next to a park, and the last this is a little crescent of buildings, and none of them looked at the park. None of them seemed to, because the park is the connection to the Thames, and the Thames is the connection is London, and London is the world, kind of, as in, it's like scale. I'm talking in terms of scale, but it's almost like you could write a very quick way of describing how to get to this building by saying, well, you start in the world, and then you go to England, then you go to London, and then you find yourself next to the Thames, you go to Burning Spain Gardens, and you find the building. It's yellow. But the building does is the new building, although it's built on the original foundations and it's doing lots of things which are efficient and carbon efficient and whatever, but it orientates itself to the park. So it's looking at the park, and in the process of looking at the park, it's looking at the Thames and therefore looking at London. And so I think why did I say that? I suppose that we didn't start. We had a client, as in a developer, but we didn't know who was going to use the building. So there are briefs for buildings which are explicit about how they're going to get used. The activity in the room, the number of people in the room, and the list of things and rooms. That's more like things like town halls, schools, health centres, arts projects. But of course, an office building is pretty vague. The way it's about creating an environment to work in, and to make a building that can accommodate that working environment, and to kind of have a sense of how it might organise itself, but not to dictate it. That's the worst thing. You want it to people to be able to reinterpret it time and time again. So it's like a good shed, and if it's got multiple stories, it's like a multi-story good shed. So then you're sort of talking about things like, how do you find it, what characters it got, and other kind of qualities. What's the quality of daylight? How do you air movement and comfort and aspect. And then of course you might start thinking about much more pragmatic things like the economics and the construction, but they are all interrelated. And that building is really an essay in how to make a facade, which is about light and air, because it's a mixed mode building. That creates, with the introduction of the terracotta colonnettes, that makes the architecture of the two primary elevations. And then the loggia is the entrance, and that is, is both an entrance but also a place to step out on every floor. It's the outside space, which we know is necessary, or it's something we go right back to 1999 when we were exploring the importance of outside space in office buildings. It's the first time we've actually managed to, the first time we've completed a new office building with ideas that we've been carrying around for 27 years or whatever, and have become now common parlance. But yeah, so the way into that building and the things that matter are very different from a building where the activities are much more explicit.
Yeah, interesting. And then stepping away from practice, you're chair of the RBA judging panel, aren't you? Or have been last year?
Yeah. No,
not this year. But
No.
but so in that capacity, then, what do you think makes a good building? Like what is award worthy within architect circles? Because I wouldn't say that's necessarily the same thing that's award worthy in other circles, which is probably quite right. But what makes it? Yeah. How does that process work?
Well, that's interesting because I actually could be very kind of pragmatic about that. I mean, it's not, on one level, judgment obviously applies. There's 24 or 25 people on the committee, so it's not a single person's view, but we kept it really discursive. We chose not to vote. We just kept talking until people felt comfortable. There was a collective view. But what I was able to do was, not alone, but with a number of other people on the panel, we rewrote the criteria, because there had been, I can't remember, about 21 criteria, and they sort of kept getting added, and some were very similar, and really sensible things weren't even mentioned. I mean, literally until last year was the first time we used the new criteria. It didn't say, has it got a good plan, elevation and section? It kept using the word innovation, no mention of tradition or history. I'm not obsessed with history. I mean, we go forwards, and we go backwards to go forwards, if you see what I mean, as in we look back to go forwards. But also culture is cyclical, whereas technology is generally forward-looking, and the architecture or the building is a combination of technology and culture. So it is by its very nature cyclical and forward-looking. And so it was. We got it down to 10, but we were 10. They were kind of questions. So again, they were questions posed to the people who were submitting their project for the awards, and they're questions posed to the juries in the regions and the national jury that I chaired, questions that we all had to answer. So when you looked at a project, there were these 10 questions, and sometimes there was a sort of supplementary question that came at the point from a couple of different angles. But that was the first time since I'd been on the committee, which would have been 5 years, so I did 6 years, 4 of them not as the chair. But to be able to be, we were much more concise, a bit more discursive, and I think it was more rounded. That kind of question of what makes a good piece of architecture. And so I don't think I can answer the question, because of course every time you're confronted with a project, that it's interesting. And one of the things, of course, is when you get to the Sterling Prize shortlist, projects are competing with each other. But actually, up until that point, through the RBA awards all around the country and the national awards, they're kind of competing with themselves. It's simply, do we collectively think, is that a good building? As opposed to, is that a better building than that building?
Yeah.
But I think hopefully one of my legacies is a good set of criteria.
That's good. And one thing you've said to me in the past is this notion of kind of, as an architect, just keeping your feet on the ground and your head in the clouds. Would you say that kind of epitomises kind of how you think about maybe the judging or
I think
your work generally?
I think the work of the office generally. I think we are not we're not hugely involved in cultural projects. We're not involved in big budget projects where, in a way, those things, where the practicalities matter less. We're always working to a budget. We're always working with strict sort of needs. We are building, as I said, sort of, I'd like to say, as the book title says, we're building for society. And yes, you got to have your feet on the ground, head in the clouds, because if you don't do those two things, you can't be ambitious, but also you can't ground what you do in common sense. And also that other people can share you've got to be able to share your values, not seem like you're at odds with everybody else and they go, oh God, bloody architects.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope that that's not the way we're we're seen. That we're seen as really collaborative, down to earth, thoughtful, but ambitious.
Yeah, you are definitely, and as I've said many times, and also earlier today, I think you're in a very small club who are actually able to do that very, very well. To be very practical, to be grounded, to understand what different stakeholders want, and to do something that is exceptional in terms of its kind of quality and elevates the experience of kind of everyday life. So I think that's a testament. And maybe just to kind of bring this conversation to a close then, if you were to kind of think in that mindset about, the rest of the next few years or broader than that, I know you said you don't like to sort of plan too much, but do you have a sense of what that kind of holds for you for the practice?
Well, a few years ago we won our first project abroad in Belgium, and most of our work has always been in London. But again, more recently we've been working on a project in Winchester, where I live, which we're working with other architects. We're working with East, Peter Barber and Turner Works. Our client is Igloo, and we're working closely with Winchester City Council. And it will, although it's not going to be a big building, it's not a tall building, but it will be the greatest transformation of Winchester in 1,000 years. Because it's a piece of land right next to the High Street and the Broadway, within the original Roman walls, a piece of land which was sort of neglected or abused, let's say, with multi-storey car parks, bus stations, and sort of fairly poor quality shopping centre. We're making new streets, making new squares, or small squares, small public spaces, new streets. We're opening up medieval waterways that were culverted huge, many, many years ago. So I think, I have huge ambitions for that, not for its scale, but for its kind of plausibility, that when we're done, people won't see it as this new bit of the city, as a kind of odd thing, but actually just as a repairing. Right at the very beginning, there was this question about is there a master plan, and I said, well, no, I don't think there's a master plan. I think it's a series of jigsaw pieces, because one end there's a 19th century almshouse or almshouses, beautiful little garden. On the other extreme, there's a 1980s, 1990s shopping centre. But if you picture literally piecing a puzzle together, the pieces of the puzzle you find, take the analogy, the pieces you'd be looking for to go next to the shopping centre are very different from the pieces you'd be looking for to go next to the almshouses. But as you build the picture and you get to the middle, the two things join up. So I think that, to me, that's going to be an important project. But there's lots of good things going on in the office. Schools, housing, student housing, stuff in London, a variety of, and ultimately it's the working relationships. It's like more projects with you.
Exactly.
That's what you want. You really want to work with people you want to work with. I mean, otherwise, it's a service or something. It's no.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, no one wants to be a management consultant.
No, we've got that out of our system.
To bring it full circle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Simon, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very privilege.
Much. Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.